Wow guys, just wow. So Xbox is in the spotlight again, surprise surprise, and as has been the norm over the last few years, it's not for any good reasons. They're cutting another 4,800 jobs, shutting down and restructuring more studios, and my shock and awe to this news at this stage goes a bit like this.
No.
Now I could make a typical analysis video here, but at this stage the deep wounds of Xbox require us to take a massive step back and look at the ongoing problems they've brought on themselves in my personal opinion. I mean, it's not like Xbox just had a bad year or lost a few exclusives or just fell behind in console sales. What's happening to Xbox can effectively be described as the modern gaming industry staring back at itself. A company with almost unlimited financial capability, and even that's an understatement, that only relatively recently bought some of the biggest studios and franchises in gaming history and built one of the most attractive subscription services available, has managed to put itself into a position of great uncertainty, primarily achieved through taking subsequent dumps on itself with atrocious decision making. I'm going to do that thing where I narrate and show on screen what that atrocious decision looks like. Or decisions, I should say. What makes this story so interesting or just plain funny is that Xbox could and should have been unstoppable. They had the money, the infrastructure, the studios and the franchises to kick on and dominate the gaming market with a strong ecosystem. On paper, this should have been one of the strongest positions in gaming history, a slam dunk as they say. But in reality, Xbox feels like a brand caught between too many identities, corporate greed, and trying to push politics rather than focusing on its original core identity. Gaming. At this point in time, I find myself asking what in the world is Xbox's main goal here? Does it still want to be a console that makes great games, innovative games? Does it want to be a subscription service? Is it a publisher or a PC ecosystem? I don't know about you guys, but I also miss the days when companies like Sony, Microsoft and Nintendo actually tried to compete against each other with great games. Dare I even say it, I miss the feeling of the old console wars. Not the childish arguments, but the feeling of competition. It all feels dead and dry right now. Xbox doesn't look like it even cares about beating PlayStation and vice versa, and I guess Nintendo is a different kettle of fish altogether, as I feel it offers a different proposition to both Microsoft and Sony with its ability to be both a handheld and a console. And I think this current situation in the gaming industry is a reflection of modern gaming today. Before we get into it guys, thank you so much for all the feedback on the last videos, and welcome to all the new subscribers. If you enjoy this type of content and hearing the perspective from an indie dev like myself, please do like, subscribe, share the video. It helps a ton with the old algorithm, so I really appreciate it. And just FYI, I'm also working on releasing a co-op game on Steam, which will be my first professional release. I will announce more on this in the future. Now, because the Xbox story is really a story about what happens when gaming becomes too big, too expensive, and too, well, corporate, to clearly remember what made people care in the first place, and that's experiencing great and unique games. To understand why this feels so strange, we have to go back to what Xbox used to be. The original Xbox was not subtle, it was big, heavy, and powerful, and clearly aimed at core gamers. It had this aggressive identity. It was Microsoft entering the console space and basically saying, we're here to compete. Then the Xbox 360 era came along, and for a while Xbox felt like the center of online console gaming. Halo 3 was massive, Gears of War became a defining franchise, and Call of Duty exploded on Xbox Live. Party chat became part of everyday gaming culture. By the way, hands up if you remember actual party chats in gaming. I feel like that's completely dead these days. I also remember when Xbox's UI and in-game chat was a huge thing. Growing up in a PlayStation household, I remember being really excited when the PS3 finally got an update to have the ability to enter the main menu when in-game, as well as having trophies for the first time. That's a prime example of Xbox leading the game market and innovating. Today that's non-existent, and it's clear why, because the emphasis is not on the gamer anymore, and it's down to the points I mentioned earlier. Xbox has lost its identity through corporate greed and pushing politics to be acceptable instead of actually standing for something. And for the record, the very concept of being acceptable to what current society thinks is foolish.
Foolishness, Dante. Foolishness.
The reality is we came into this world alone and we'll go back to God alone, so respectfully, I believe we should stand by what God wants us to do rather than what society wants us to do, because if you look back through history, the rules of society are constantly changing and what was considered right today is wrong tomorrow. Also, if you've noticed, the very question of morality doesn't even exist anymore. Now, to be clear, I still respect everyone's way of life. Respect is a very different thing to what we believe is morally right or wrong. We should still all respect and love each other. I'm just highlighting this as it's what I live by, and it's just just something that's not present in the gaming industry or society in general anymore. Back on point, achievements changed how players interacted with games. Xbox Arcade helped bring smaller digital games to a wider console audience. Whether you preferred Xbox or not, you knew what Xbox stood for. It felt social, it felt competitive and portrayed confidence. It was, for a while at least, the place where online console gaming lived during the Xbox 360 era. And that's important because gaming brands represent more than just machines you play on. They express the feelings you experience when you played your favorite titles. I'll give you a great example. Nintendo feels like creativity, nostalgia, experimentation, and family. PlayStation often feels cinematic, premium, and focused on big single-player experiences. Steam feels open and player-driven, tied to that PC gaming culture. But Xbox used to have that same kind of emotional identity. I often saw it when I was younger as a place for FPS games and as having an established online community and culture. It was the place where you played Halo with friends until 2 in the morning. You see how that version of Xbox feels a lot more clearer than what you see today. But over time that clarity started to fade. The message slowly changed from buy an Xbox because of Halo or Forza to play and hang out with your friends to play Xbox anywhere. You can see how that direction and message is way less definitive. And strategically you can understand why Microsoft went in that direction. If the console market is hard to win outright, then maybe you should stop thinking like a traditional console company. Maybe you try become the platform being gaming itself. Maybe you push Game Pass, PC, cloud mobile subscriptions, and publishing all at once. As a business idea it makes sense, but emotionally it creates a problem. If Xbox is trying to cater to every market, what makes Xbox so special? If you don't need an Xbox console to play Xbox games, then what is the Xbox console really for? The whole unique selling point becomes completely diluted, and I think that's the disconnect between the leaders at Microsoft and Xbox and the audience they're trying to sell to. Or rather, a misunderstanding of what made their own brand and console so successful in the first place. And if Xbox games are part of the wider Microsoft content strategy, then what is the creative identity holding all of this together? That is where the Xbox spiral begins. Not with one bad decision, but with a slow loss of focus. For years, the obvious criticism of Xbox was simple. They needed more games. PlayStation had its big first-party exclusives. Nintendo had its legendary franchises. Xbox had Halo, Gears, and Forza, but it often felt like it was struggling to create the same consistent pipeline of major releases. So Xbox started buying studios, and we all remember how exciting that was at first. Bethesda joining Xbox was huge. Then Activision Blizzard happened, and suddenly Microsoft owned some of the biggest franchises in the world. Call of Duty, Diablo, World of Warcraft, Candy Crush, Fallout, The Elder Scrolls. From the outside at least, it looked like Xbox was building a video game empire dynasty. And it was easy to think Xbox is going to dominate the gaming scene, and for a short while they did, especially when the Game Pass value was at its peak. More studios meant more games, which equates to greater value for the Game Pass. With more value, you naturally get more players. However, the problem is that buying studios does not automatically create great game experiences. Additionally, it also created greater expectations, which is why we're seeing so many layoffs right now. You see, because Microsoft spent tens and billions of dollars on purchasing these iconic studios, these devs are no longer just creative teams making games. They became part of a much larger corporate machine that needs to justify its investment. That changed the question being asked. Instead of simply asking, what is the best game this team can make, the Microsoft question became, how does this fit into the overall portfolio? How does this drive the Game Pass? How does this increase engagement? And how does this create reoccurring revenue? And I know we touched on this in my previous videos, but some of the best games ever made were not born from safe corporate logic. They were born from strange ideas, risky creative decisions, focused teams, and strong identities. BioShock was not memorable because it was designed to fill a subscription slot, and Metal Gear Solid didn't become iconic because it was optimized for monthly active usage. And Half-Life wasn't instrumental in defining the shooter genre because it looked at a spreadsheet and decided environmental storytelling had strong retention potential. Those games worked because the teams behind them had a vision, a specific idea, a world they wanted to build, and an experience they wanted the player to have. And that is what gets harder to protect when everything becomes part of a giant content strategy. So I would argue that this is not just an Xbox problem, it's a modern AAA problem. And from my perspective as an indie developer, the industry keeps telling itself that scale solves everything. Bigger budgets and teams, acquisitions equal automatic success. But as we've seen time and time again, bigger doesn't always mean better. Some of my favorite childhood games were made by small, tight teams working and having fun together. On the contrast, in the current environment, bigger teams are usually hired in to work at scale on a safe idea that the stakeholders know will generate revenue. That's why remakes and remasters are so popular. The creative work has already been done. They are true and tested ideas, and sometimes they even mess those up. However, the sad reality is when the results don't match expectations, the consequences still usually fall on the developers. And this is where the Xbox story really becomes genuinely painful. A lot of these studios that have been closed did produce great games, but I feel corporate greed and politics drove them into the ground. For example, with the attempted closure of Compulsion Games, South of Midnight did have a very cool art style, but it just looks like a game trying to push a message rather than something that caters for an audience. And please tell me if I'm wrong here, like I don't know who that game was for, and it shows with the attempted closure of the studio by Xbox. However, if you didn't know, these guys also made We Happy Few, which when I first played it years back was actually quite fun and was a unique concept, but again it lost its identity due to corporate intervention. And the same story goes for Double Fine. Both Compulsion and Double Fine weren't shut down outright, but the fact that they had to be spun out of Xbox to survive as independent studios says a lot about the state of the Xbox portfolio. Similarly, when Microsoft closed studios like Arcane Austin and their attempted closure of Tango Gameworks, which was subsequently saved by Krafton, yes, Arcane Austin had struggled with Redfall, absolutely. Redfall was not the kind of game players expected, especially from a studio associated with immersive design, player freedom, and systems-driven gameplay. Arcane as a studio still meant a lot, producing some of my favorite games like Prey and Dishonored. That style of game design is rare. It's not the kind of thing the industry produces easily. So when a studio like that is closed, players don't just see a failed project, they see another piece of creative identity disappearing from the industry. And then there was Tango Gameworks. This is one that felt especially strange to myself and many of you out there because Tango had just released Hi-Fi Rush, one of the most creative and refreshing games connected to Xbox in years. It was colourful and stylish and had a lot of personality. It wasn't trying to be everything to everyone or trying to push a message. It had a clear idea and committed to it. In other words, it was exactly the kind of game players constantly say they want more of. And yet the studio still ended up being closed. That's the kind of moment where people start asking, what does success even look like anymore? If a studio releases something as fresh as Hi-Fi Rush and still isn't safe, what message does that send to the rest of the gaming industry? To me, this is one of the clearest examples of the disconnect between what players value and what corporations actually reward. Now, personally, as both a game developer myself and a gamer, I want to see the passion of those developers through the game. I want to see the game through their eyes, if that makes sense. I want to see that originality and that identity. But companies keep chasing scale, growth, and predictable returns. Most of us say that we're tired of these safe games, repetitive mechanics, and soulless content. By the way, if you're quite interested in the topic of soulless gaming content in the current modern era versus the golden age of the 90s and early 2000s, then check out my last video where I talk about this in more detail. The challenge is that the teams making interesting focused games still seem vulnerable if they don't fit into the overall larger business model. And this is exactly why Xbox feels like such a useful case study. It shows the contradiction at the heart of modern gaming. The industry says it wants creativity, but it often punishes risk. It appears to want player trust, but then makes decisions that convince players like you and me to not trust them at all whatsoever. Even looking at the recent ports of Black Ops 1 and 2, and yes, they're literally ports because there's been no new mechanics added to the game apart from the new servers. And I will be playing these games, yes, because of the nostalgia and because they're just great games, but it was the least effort port you could see out there and a clear cash correction after the recent flops of Black Ops 7, or as I like to call it, Blop 7. Otherwise, they would have priced it at $15 for each game or $30 with both for all the DLCs. I mean, even the logic behind that is a horrible business decision. I mean, financially speaking, you would make way more money if you packaged or bundled both games for $30 with all the DLCs. By the way, that game is so old that I just can't understand $40 per game, and yes, I know it's discounted for PS Plus members, but it's still the principle behind it. Now, in the middle of all this is Game Pass. Now, Game Pass is complicated because as a player, it can be an incredible deal. You pay a monthly fee and get access to a huge library of games. For discovery, especially for smaller titles, that can be amazing. It puts your games in front of players who may never have bought them at full price. For families or people on a budget, it can genuinely make gaming more accessible. So I don't think the honest argument is Game Pass is bad, not at all. It's not that simple. The real question is, what kind of industry does a subscription model create over time? Because subscriptions change incentives. A traditional game has to convince you to buy it. A subscription service has to convince you to stay. That's a huge difference, because the question Xbox is asking itself now versus before is how do we keep players playing rather than how do we create great gaming experiences. And not just Xbox, by the way, obviously Sony and Nintendo have their own subscription services. This changes everything, because when the goal is to sell one complete game, the focus is usually on making that game appealing enough to purchase, like I mentioned earlier. But when the goal is to keep someone subscribed month after month, the focus shifts towards constant engagement. So for instance, the library has to always feel full, the service has to feel active, and there has to be something new being released every week. And that leads to saturation of gaming content over time. And it also places the emphasis on quantity over quality, because games become content and studios become content suppliers. And instead of every game needing to stand as a complete memorable experience, we just end up getting dopamine hits. Now don't get me wrong, I did say it earlier and I'll say it again, we still have a ton of unique great games. And I do think overall, at least at the original price point that they had, the Game Pass was for the greater good. But it has led to a very different relationship between the player and the game. When you buy a game, you're choosing that game, you're committing to it. You paid to own it, and there's a certain weight to that decision. Also, with games being digital now, you lose that sense of emotion the box art design gave you, the feel in your hand you used to have, the smell of the manuals in the case. Don't pretend like you didn't sniff those manuals when you were young too, and maybe even now. I don't know about you guys, but when I browse a gaming subscription service, I often feel overwhelmed and end up spending more time scrolling, run out of time, and end up not even playing anything. And again, I'm not trying to be negative here, it's not always bad. Discovery is valuable, especially if you're an indie developer like me, and I've definitely found some great indie games through the Game Pass that I probably wouldn't have picked up otherwise. But it does change how games are perceived, and for developers like myself and others, that can be a scary thing. If players are trained to expect more and more games inside a subscription, then what happens to the focused mid-budget game? What happens to the weird single-player project that doesn't generate endless engagement? And what about the game that's brilliant for 8 hours but doesn't fit neatly into a retention model? This is the Game Pass trap. It gives players value, but it also raises difficult questions about how games are funded, valued, and protected. And Xbox is right at the center of that tension. That tension also affects the console itself. For decades, the purpose of a console was obvious. You bought a console because it had the games you wanted. Nintendo had Zelda, Pokemon, Mario and Metroid. PlayStation had Metal Gear Solid, Gran Turismo, Crash Bandicoot. And Xbox had Halo, Gears, and Forza. But Xbox has slowly moved toward a future where the console is no longer the center of the strategy. Xbox games are on PC, some are moving to other consoles and vice versa. Cloud gaming exists. Microsoft talks less like a traditional console company and more like an ecosystem organization. From a business point of view, maybe that's its future, but from a player's point of view, it creates uncertainty. Because if I don't need the Xbox console to experience Xbox, then why should I emotionally invest in that console? Why should I believe in the brand as a platform? And why should I expect a traditional console future from a company that seems less interested in the traditional competition for the best titles? It starts to paint the question, do players believe Xbox knows what it wants to be? And do developers believe Xbox will protect them? Because so far they haven't. And what about the fans and players like myself? Do you believe the Xbox you grew up with still exists? And it's the same for Sony and even Nintendo. However, for Nintendo, it's more from a corporate greed standpoint. Guys, seriously, do actual sales of your first party games. I'm talking 15 and 20 euro. Not freaking, oh, it was 100 euro for the deluxe edition, it's now 80. That's not a sale. Like and comment below if you miss the days you can walk into your local shop and buy 2 games for 30 euros, $30 or 30 pounds. Like even the discoverability of walking in the shop and finding new games for you that are old games that you could actually purchase at a decent price. Did that English make sense? Probably not. Now, I do feel Nintendo still focuses on creativity unlike the former two, so I will give them bonus points there, but they have another problem. What Microsoft and others need to realize is gaming is not purely rational, it's emotional. People buy into ecosystems because of trust, identity, and expectation, and if that identity becomes unclear, well, players start hesitating, and once they hesitate, this whole spiral of lost identity gets worse and worse. But the big reason this story matters, as I mentioned earlier, is because Xbox is not alone. Xbox is simply the clearest example of a much wider industry problem. Across AAA gaming as a whole, we keep seeing the same patterns. Development timelines are constantly being cut due to the need to meet annual targets, leading to unfinished games. Teams get inflated, leading to greater investor expectations, and when that doesn't happen, you see all the layoffs which are happening right now. The sad outcome is that the creative risk starts to be perceived as more dangerous because failure becomes more costly. So publishers become more cautious and lean on sequels, remakes, and reboots. That is one of the contradictions players are feeling. Games are bigger than ever, but they don't always feel more meaningful. And it's why so many players like myself and those of you watching often talk about older games. It's not always the nostalgia or people getting older, it's that those games were genuinely better. The incentives have changed. Xbox's current struggle is not just a failure of branding or management, it's a warning about what happens when a gaming company becomes so focused on scale that it starts losing the emotional connection that made people care in the first place. But I don't want this video to end with the idea that everything is doomed, because I genuinely don't feel. In fact, I feel the opposite. The other bright side of this whole thing is that while the biggest companies are struggling under the weight of their own scale and poor decision making, the smaller teams and indie devs have a huge opportunity in their hands. And we're already seeing it. Players are hungry for games with identity that feel authored. Games that know exactly what they're trying to achieve, their gameplay focus, and target audience they want to cater for. And that is exactly why we're seeing so many indie games and smaller projects breaking through the AAA. Simply put, these devs are making the games they want to make. That's the key focus, the games they want to make, not the games the shareholders or the industry wants to push, and certainly not under the pressures of shareholders that understand nothing about the gaming industry. And as someone making games myself, that is the part of this whole situation that genuinely excites me. Because when these big companies consistently fail to deliver passion, it creates a space for smaller creators to step in. Players are tired of games that feel like products first and creative works second. If I look at myself as a gamer as well, I actually want to feel like I'm rewarded for progressing in a game with a new game mechanic like they used to do in the older games, or actual in-game rewards. And that is where indie developers, solo developers and smaller studios can compete, not by outspending Xbox or outmarketing PlayStation, but by making something focused, polished and memorable. So is Xbox falling apart? I don't think Xbox is dead. A company with that much money, that many studios, and that many franchises doesn't just simply disappear. But I do think the Xbox we knew is gone, and whatever replaces it will tell us a lot about where gaming is heading next. If Xbox becomes just another corporate content machine, then it becomes a warning sign. A warning sign that even the biggest companies can lose their identity and their player base when growth becomes more important than vision. But if Xbox learns from this, finds a clear purpose and protects creative teams and gives players a reason to believe again, then maybe it can recover and become the powerhouse it once was. The bigger point is this: gaming doesn't need bigger companies, it needs clear visions. It needs teams that are allowed to have the creative space to make the games that they want, and business models in place that support that very creativity instead of slowly crushing it. And it needs players to keep rewarding games that respect their time, intelligence, and passion. Because if we keep rewarding this chaotic, engagement-focused gaming spiral, that spiral will just continue. But that's enough for me. Let me know what you think is going to happen with Xbox and the wider state of consoles in the comments below. Also, if you've watched all the way to the end, I just want to say a massive thank you. It really means more than you think. And if you enjoy this type of content, as well as game devlogs and remake videos, do subscribe, like, and share the video. I'm genuinely grateful to anyone who does. As always, thanks for watching guys, drink some coffee, code, and I'll catch you in the next one.